There's a pattern nobody warns you about when you start working on yourself, when you start questioning things, when you start growing, evolving, becoming more conscious. The pattern is this: the more you evolve, the lonelier you get. Not because you're becoming arrogant, not because you're looking down on people, but because evolution creates distance. The more you grow, the fewer people can meet you where you are. And at first, that feels like punishment. Like you're being penalized for doing the work everyone says you should do. You read the books, you go to therapy, you examine your patterns, you question your beliefs, you become more self-aware, more conscious, more intentional. And your reward? Fewer people understand you. Fewer conversations feel meaningful. Fewer relationships survive your transformation. I remember the first time I noticed this. I'd spent a year in intensive therapy, really digging into my patterns, my childhood wounds, my defense mechanisms. And I came out of it different, more aware, more honest with myself. And suddenly, conversations I used to enjoy felt hollow. Friends I used to connect with felt distant. Small talk became unbearable in a way it never was before. At first, I thought I was the problem, that therapy had made me judgmental, that self-awareness had made me unable to just relax and be normal. But then I realized I hadn't become judgmental. I'd just outgrown the level of consciousness I used to operate on, and most people in my life were still there. Heraclitus said it centuries ago. You cannot step into the same river twice. But what he didn't say is that sometimes you evolve so much that you can't even recognize the river anymore, and the people still swimming in it can't recognize you either. So let's talk about this uncomfortable truth, about why evolution requires solitude, why growth creates distance, why becoming more conscious means becoming more alone. Because if you're on this path, if you're doing the work of evolving, you need to know, the loneliness isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's evidence you're doing it right. I've been where you are, wondering if growth is worth the isolation it creates. Subscribe if you're tired of feeling alone in your evolution. If you need to know that the path gets lonely, but you're not walking it alone. We're going to explore why solitude isn't the cost of evolution. It's the necessary condition for it. First, understand what happens when you evolve. Your tolerance for bullshit drops to zero. And I don't mean you become intolerant or judgmental. I mean you literally cannot participate in things you used to tolerate. Your system rejects it, like your body rejecting food that's gone bad. Conversations that go nowhere. Relationships based on habit rather than connection. Social performances where everyone's pretending. Drama for drama's sake. People who complain but never change. Interactions that drain more than they give. You used to be able to handle it, maybe even enjoyed some of it. But evolution changes your operating system, and suddenly what used to be tolerable becomes intolerable. Nietzsche wrote, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die." But what he didn't mention is that when you cast your skin, when you shed who you were, most people still see the old skin. They expect you to be who you were, and when you're not, they don't know what to do with you. Picture this. Every weekend in my 20s, same friend group, same bars, same surface-level conversations. I loved it, or thought I did. Then I started evolving, reading philosophy, going to therapy, questioning why I believed what I believed. And those weekend gatherings started feeling empty, like I was performing a role that didn't fit anymore. I tried to bring depth to the conversations, tried to talk about ideas, about growth, about things that mattered to me now, and I watched their eyes glaze over, watched them change the subject back to familiar territory. They hadn't changed. I had. And that change opened a gap I couldn't bridge by just trying harder. But losing tolerance for surface-level connection is just the first shift. Something deeper happens when you evolve. You start seeing patterns everywhere. In yourself, in others, in relationships, in society. Patterns that were always there but you couldn't see before because you were inside them. And once you see patterns, you can't unsee them. You can't participate in them unconsciously anymore. Jung understood this. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But the flip side is brutal. Once you make it conscious, once you see the patterns, you can no longer blame fate. You see your role. You see others' roles. You see the whole dance. And that awareness puts you on the outside looking in. Because most people are still dancing unconsciously, and you're standing there watching the choreography, unable to pretend you don't see it. Then the patterns became impossible to ignore. Family dinners where the same conflicts played out like clockwork. How certain arguments happened the same way every time. How people had roles they never deviated from. How the same conversations repeated every holiday year after year with nobody learning anything. And once I saw it, really saw it, I couldn't participate the same way. I couldn't play my assigned role. I couldn't pretend the patterns weren't there. My family interpreted this as me being distant, cold, changed. And they weren't wrong. I had changed. I'd evolved past unconscious participation in patterns that didn't serve anyone. But try explaining that at Thanksgiving dinner. Try saying, I've evolved past our family's dysfunctional patterns without sounding arrogant. So you don't explain. You just become more alone. Seeing patterns isolates you from others. But there's an even deeper reason evolution requires solitude, one that has nothing to do with other people at all. Growth happens in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. And that space is uncomfortable, uncertain, formless. You can't rush through it, you can't skip it, you have to sit in it. Alone. Rilke wrote to a young poet, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once, with beauty and courage." But he also said, "The only journey is the one within. And that journey, the real one, the one that actually transforms you, can only be traveled alone. You can't evolve in constant company. You can't transform while performing for an audience. You can't become who you're meant to be while managing everyone else's comfort with your changes. Evolution requires solitude because solitude is where you meet yourself, the real self, not the performed self, not the self others expect, but the actual evolving, constantly becoming self. And most people never meet that self. They're too busy, too distracted, too afraid of what they'll find if they sit alone long enough to actually look. 6 months. That's how long I spent mostly alone after a major life transition. Not by choice initially, but I stopped fighting it, stopped filling every moment with social noise, just sat with myself. And it was brutal. I had to face things I'd been avoiding, patterns I'd been denying, truths I'd been running from, parts of myself I didn't like. But on the other side of that solitude, I emerged different, more integrated, more whole, more me than I'd ever been. And when I came out of that period and tried to reconnect with people from before, we'd become strangers. I'd evolved. They hadn't, and neither of us knew how to bridge that gap. Evolution also requires solitude because other people's expectations are loud, and your authentic voice is quiet. When you're constantly around people, especially people who knew you before you started evolving, they reinforce who they think you are, who you were, who they need you to be for their own comfort, and their expectations drown out your emerging self. The person you're becoming can't speak up over the noise of who everyone expects you to be. Kierkegaard wrote, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are, but the path to being who you are requires solitude. Because solitude is the only place quiet enough to hear your authentic voice." My career was the wake-up call, successful, respected, and completely wrong for who I was becoming. Everyone, family, friends, colleagues, had expectations about my path forward, what I should do next, how I should leverage my success. But in solitude, when I was honest with myself, I realized I didn't want any of it. The path everyone expected me to take wasn't my path. The success they celebrated didn't fulfill me. The person they saw wasn't who I was becoming, but I couldn't hear that realization in the noise of other people's expectations. I could only hear it alone, in silence, in the space where no one else's voice was louder than my own. And acting on that realization, changing course, disappointing expectations, choosing an unconventional path, required even more solitude, because the people who'd known me before couldn't support a version of me they didn't understand. The hardest truth about evolution and solitude: the higher you go, the fewer people can come with you. Not because you're leaving them behind intentionally, not because you think you're better, but because evolution is intensely personal. Your journey up the mountain isn't their journey. And at a certain altitude, the air gets thin. Not everyone can breathe up there. Schopenhauer said, "Solitude is the fate of all exceptional spirits." But it's not about being exceptional in a superior way. It's about becoming exceptional, as in an exception, different from the norm, operating on a different frequency. And the more you evolve, the more you become an exception. Until you're so different from who you were, so different from most people around you, that connection becomes rare. My oldest friend, known each other since childhood, inseparable through our 20s. We didn't have a falling out, didn't fight, just drifted. Then we both entered our 30s, and our paths diverged. I went deep into personal growth. She stayed on a more conventional path. And slowly, conversation by conversation, we had less to talk about. Not because I didn't care about her, not because she wasn't important to me, but because evolution had moved me to a different frequency, and she'd stayed on one I could no longer tune into at the level I now operated on. We didn't have dramatic conflict, just gradual fading, because evolution creates distance neither of us knew how to cross. And that hurt, still does sometimes, but it's the cost of growth, of becoming, of evolving into your truest self. Evolution requires solitude because transformation is messy, and you can't afford to have an audience while you're falling apart and reassembling. Growth isn't linear. It's not pretty. You don't just smoothly become a better version of yourself. You fall apart. You question everything. You go through dark nights of the soul where you don't know who you are anymore. And you can't do that work with people around who need you to be stable, consistent, the person they're comfortable with. Camus wrote, "In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. But you can only find that summer by walking through the winter, alone, without anyone trying to shortcut you through it or pull you out before you're ready. Everything I thought I knew about myself? Wrong. My identity, values, beliefs, all of it crumbled. And I had to rebuild from scratch. I couldn't have done that with people around. They would have tried to fix me, comfort me, assure me I was fine. They wouldn't have understood that I needed to fall apart, that the falling apart was necessary for the becoming. Solitude gave me the space to be a mess, to not have answers, to live in the questions until real answers emerged. And when I came through it, I was unrecognizable, not just to others, but to myself. I'd evolved so profoundly that almost no one from my old life could meet me in my new one. Here's what nobody tells you about evolution and solitude. It's not temporary. You don't evolve, spend some time alone, and then rejoin the crowd at a higher level. Evolution is ongoing, and so is the solitude. Because once you commit to growth, once you start evolving, you can't stop. Every level you reach reveals new patterns to see, new beliefs to question, new versions of yourself to become. And each evolution requires more solitude, more space, more time alone to integrate, to understand, to become. Marcus Aurelius understood. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. But it's not a retreat you visit occasionally. It's where you live now. Because evolution has made solitude your home. I used to think I'd do the work, evolve, and then have more meaningful connections with people, better relationships, deeper community. And in some ways, that's true. The connections I have now are deeper, more authentic, more aligned. But they're also fewer, much fewer. Because evolution is rare, most people aren't willing to do the work, and you can't connect deeply with people operating at a different level of consciousness. So solitude isn't temporary. It's the natural state of someone committed to continuous evolution. But here's the paradox that makes it bearable. The more you evolve, the more comfortable you become with solitude. At first, it's painful. You feel isolated, misunderstood, alone in a way that hurts. But as you continue evolving, as you spend more time in solitude, something shifts. You realize this is where you're most yourself, most alive, most free. Solitude stops being loneliness and becomes sanctuary, the place where you don't have to perform, where you can be completely honest. Where evolution happens without resistance. Frankl wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." And solitude is that space, the place where you can evolve consciously, deliberately, authentically, without the noise, without the expectations, without the pressure to stay who you were for the comfort of people who aren't evolving with you. So what do you do with this truth? First, stop fighting the solitude that comes with evolution. Stop seeing it as punishment or evidence that something's wrong. It's not. It's necessary. Second, find others who are evolving. They're rare, but they exist. And one connection with someone operating at your level of consciousness is worth 100 connections with people who need you to stay small. Third, trust the process. The loneliness you feel now is temporary. The solitude becomes sanctuary. The distance from your old life creates space for your new one. Evolution requires solitude. But solitude also enables evolution. It's not a bug. It's a feature. So here's what I want to know. What moment made you realize you'd outgrown your old life? Was it a conversation that suddenly felt empty? A relationship that no longer fit? A realization that nobody around you understood who you were becoming? Tell me in the comments. Because evolution is lonely, but it's also shared. And hearing your story might help someone else understand that the solitude they're feeling isn't wrong. It's growth. Share your evolution moment. Let's prove that the path gets lonely, but we're not walking it alone.